5,000 square feet because Donald, he loves to dance.
You got the recording on.
Oh, okay. I should stop with my Saturday Night Live references.
Oh my.
Editing is key.
Editing is key.
Excellent.
All right, good morning. It's good to see so many people here early.
Thank you.
Welcome to today's event. This is going to be fun. Panel discussion with our historians and our token political scientists that we pulled in to moderate. So this last year and this year and into next year, we have been doing a series of events on the American Revolution's 250th anniversary. So 250 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence this coming summer, July 4th. And it seemed relevant given the conversations and challenges that we're having as a country. So the ongoing conversation about how does democracy work? Does democracy work anymore? What does that mean? It seemed like a time to reflect back over 250 years. We have some past events on our YouTube channel. By the way, this event is being streamed out to our YouTube channel, so if you wanted to rewatch, again, it's there. And we have another event coming up, moderated by Kevin, who about the red and blue of America. I'm trying to think, what's the other event that we have? Yeah, that's it, the geography of culture. So talking about kind of how we are in this world that we're seeing kind of the world differently depending on what side of the political spectrum you fall on. So I think it's an important conversation to have. Today, we're reflecting on Ken Burns' documentary on the American Revolution that just came out. So I want to thank our historians, thank Kevin for moderating. Everyone can introduce themselves. This is a fun group. I'm always excited by their debates and conversations with themselves. So kind of a good opportunity. So I will turn it over to Kevin to moderate. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Troy.
Thank you, Troy. Thanks for having us. And thank you to Michelle, our interpreter up front. Thank you all for being here. I know some of you have to be here for class, but it's still good to have an audience.
Captive
and we
audience.
look forward to hearing your questions, comments that you may have as well. So I'll let each of the panel members introduce themselves. I can't even remember if I introduced myself. I'm Kevin Navratil. I'm a political science professor at Moraine.
My name is Mary Fleece Dunkel. Good morning. I teach history and rarely political science and sociology, and I'm also the college's study abroad coordinator.
Hi, I'm Josh Fulton. I teach history and humanities here at the college, and I'm also the faculty facilitator for the college's honors program.
Hi, I'm Jim McIntyre. I teach history here at the college as well.
All right, thank you all. So to start off with, I thought we could just get the ball rolling with maybe talking about one major takeaway, something from the series that really stood out to you, something new that you learned, or maybe something you disagreed with, but just any kind of major takeaway.
You guys, I'm going to yield to you guys, please.
All right, major takeaway. So I'm someone who was really transfixed by Ken Burns's. I was at that age where I was really interested in history, and when Ken Burns's Civil War documentary came out. I was probably about 10 or 11. And of course, at that time, there wasn't that much on television, and so the way in which, I was both interested in the Civil War. They had three channels. Come on, but I was both A, interested in the subject matter, and B, I was sort of primed for that, and I really responded to kind of the way in which he did that, and I thought that. I guess the updated way in which he attempted to approach this, I think, was really good. And I was saying this to my colleague earlier the other day that I think this is a very well done documentary in that it takes some of the criticisms of his World War II documentary to heart, in that you can only cover so much. You can't be all things to all people, but I think it does a fairly good job of highlighting kind of the many, many faceted ways of thinking about the revolution. So not just from the perspective of Washington, not just from the perspective of key figures, but a sort of, I guess, much broader approach. And I really liked that.
So, building on my colleagues' comments, what struck me most in a positive sense was how balanced he was, and managed to hit on a variety of different subtopics connected to the American Revolution and the War of Independence. My big criticism, which I borrow from Jack Rakoff, who is one of the eminent historians of the period, is really it should be titled the American War of Independence, because they don't actually spend, like historians, and maybe this, well, yeah, it's going to sound like splitting hairs, but we look at that period from, say, 1763, 65 to 1775 as being the Revolution. Why? Because people here went from being proud, loyal British subjects to wanting independence, or at least some of them did. But then you have this war about, are we going to break away or not? And so they're two kind of different things. And he tends to spend a lot of time on the latter.
So I don't know if, as first of all, thank you to the two of you for going first, for breaking the ice. I do appreciate that. My problem is I have a hard time sometimes bringing it all together in my mind. I agree with Professor Fulton. I like Ken Burns' documentaries because he tries to tell stories of like everyday people. He tries to make it relatable. So for people who necessarily maybe don't have that background of history, they make jokes a lot of times on like SNL and things like that about, it's kind of like your dad's version, like your dad loves Ken Burns documentaries because they're it's the kind of stuff that you'll maybe see on the History Channel, but a bit warmer and with like very eminent historians in there. One thing I did write down, the comment, and this is a way that I haven't, we talk about this in my history classes, but it's worded so well, it's more succinct than I ever put it, but the idea of the revolution being a civil war, I think was one of the takeaways that kind of struck me. Because it does make a lot of sense, right? The idea of, we always talk about the Civil War being a brother fighting brother, but when they're covering some of the fighting that was taking place in the Southern campaign in South Carolina, you literally had these cases of brother fighting brother and friend fighting friend, families fighting one another over control of South Carolina. So that, I think, was probably my biggest, big picture takeaway. I have a lot of other ones, but that's probably my biggest big one. My biggest big one. That was very glib.
Interestingly, that was one of the major takeaways I had from the documentary too. And I don't know if we said this. I think it's 8 hours. It's 4 2-hour.
Yeah, it's six,
series.
actually, 6 episodes.
It's
I just
12
looked it up.
hours.
I thought it was 6, right?
Yeah,
12 hours.
6 episodes. Was it 12 hours?
yes.
We don't even know. It was so long. We don't even know how long it was. That's how long it was.
I may have missed those last.
I know.
It was competitive
So
with the war.
there's a lot of content, but one of those takeaways of just how diverse and fractionalized the American territory was at that time, the colonies at that time. So how do you see those differences and competing factions, like how does that translate into today in terms of how arguably there's a lot of polarization, a lot of diverse interests? So how does, 250 years ago, all of those differences and competing factions, what kind of parallels do you see to today's politics?
So, do you mind if I? Do you mind?
Go for it.
You sure?
Go for it.
Oh, yeah, please go ahead.
So, Professor Swanson kindly provided us a few criticisms for us to look at, and I looked at one of the ones that Jim, that you referenced in yours, because I agreed with some of the things that he wrote, but that was the incoherence of that was the one entitled "Incoherence" of Ken Burns' documentary. He kind of calls it like it's being too woke. He makes reference to Washington compelling his troops to get inoculated from smallpox, which was something that we've talked about in my classes for years, that in 1776, and indeed other years too, smallpox was like rampaging areas of the country. And so he basically, started off with a little bit more, not forcing everybody at first, but then eventually forcibly inoculating. And what that meant, which I have to be honest, having read depictions and then seeing it, this is from actually an HBO miniseries, John Adams, they would literally cut your arm, make a little cut in your arm with some nasty knife that was probably, or scalpel that was not at all sanitized, and take kind of the live virus from some poor soul who was suffering from smallpox and kind of like stab it into your open wound. And that was sort of a rudimentary form of inoculation at that time. So he references that as being a thing that made this documentary too woke. And then the idea of like there's a handful of women dressed as men. But you know, those are things that we talked about in the Civil War. Those are things, so there's nothing new, I would say. I think that there's like this to call that necessarily a new version of it. In other words, to try to relate it to what's happening today and to try to make it seem as though he's spinning it, I think is not necessarily a fair comparison. I don't know. I don't know what both of you think.
I would agree. Most of those topics, because we've each looked at the American Revolution for some time, they're not surprises to any of us, you know, that much of the Continental Army was actually African American and Native American. That might surprise some folks out there, but read any well-done book where they look at what are called muster rolls, which is when you signed up, they would write down your name, where you were from, and a physical description in case you decided to desert and they had to go looking for you. So we have this, you know, we have these records that tell us, hey, this was the composition. And that's, I mean, those studies have been around since the bicentennial, since the mid-'70s. So they're nothing new.
No.
And so I agree. And actually, I will point out very quickly, Rakov's was a little bit different. He was just more looking at the ideology aspect and parsing that out.
Did I confuse them? Is that the one that
Yeah, the incoherence, I looked at that one as
Okay,
well.
it's
and
a
he was-
different one
yeah,
than
he
when you
was-
were
he was-
referencing. Sorry.
Yeah,
I can
go for it.
building on what Professor McIntyre and others have said, you know, to this point about division and connecting to today, you know, the thing that I'm thinking of is just sort of, and the criticisms of Ken Burns is that I think one, this gets to the heart of what do we want, you know, what do we as a society want out of history? You know, what do we want it to be? And also, what do we want out of our documentaries, right? Documentaries aren't necessarily supposed to be the be-all, end-all, right? They're supposed to be a gateway to go learn more, right? You know, they can provide great content, and they do, but, you know, Burns is at his best when he's providing a gateway for us to go learn more about stuff. And to Professor McIntyre's point, you know, it updates, you know, kind of as a gateway, a lot of scholarship that has existed for years, but that just hasn't necessarily, you know, kind of engaged others of, you know, the work on smallpox in this period is awful and fascinating, but it's been there for a couple decades of, you know, it's not necessarily new, but it gets again to that idea of what do we want out of documentaries? What do we want to think out of history? Does it need to only cover certain things in a certain way for us to think that it's all right? You know, it certainly reflects kind of that age-old debate of, you know, must history tell a sort of positive tale, and is that history or is it nostalgia?
Right, right.
Certainly.
But I think that they do cover the idea that, and this was true, that there were people who resisted, because eventually it starts with the army, right? And then eventually he starts to like force particular towns to get forced inoculation. And there is some resistance to it. Yeah. So that is a similar thing to today, that people kind of resist. You know, we're kind of a difficult lot sometimes in the United States, going back even to that time. And I think part of that has to do with kind of the makeup of this country. We start off as sort of being like the kids that were left to kind of raise themselves, sort of, you know? And so we kind of balk at authority. Americans like balking authority. And I think you see that throughout that era, the Revolutionary War era, into today. We don't like being told what to do, right? You can't drink that tea, or you can only drink that tea. Don't tell me that. I'm going to drink whatever tea I want to drink, right? It's like telling, I always tell my students in American History 1, like, it would be like being told you could only drink Starbucks. You know, good luck, we're all going to go bankrupt. Like, you know, that's not going to work. So I think that is a fair comparison to today. That I think that we've not changed that much as far as that goes.
Reminder to all of you, the documentary is available for free on the Moraine Valley Library's website. Otherwise, you have to have like a PBS subscription to be able to watch it online, to watch it on their website. So highly recommend going to the Moraine Valley Library site. Couple of points here. Has anybody seen Saving Private Ryan? Any of you?
Wow.
I don't know if the spoiler alert, but it looks like much of the movie is trying to save this Private Ryan. I believe it was what, 3 of his brothers had already been killed.
On D-Day.
And
It starts off on D-Day.
Yeah, in the line of duty in World War II. And so, Jim, you talked about how many of the people who were serving on the Continental Army were African Americans and natives. I believe there was one anecdote that there was a Native American woman who lost 5 of her
Yes.
sons.
Yeah.
In maybe even one battle, something like that, but in a short
Yeah,
amount of
'cause-
time period. So I found that really profound. But just thinking about the lives of American natives and what transpired after 1775, and for blacks in America as well, with slavery continuing for decades, at least in the South. So any counterfactuals, like if England had won, would their lives potentially have been better? Like, was this, were they fighting on the wrong side? Were they?
That's a
I'll
difficult choice.
take the lead on that one.
Go ahead,
I
Professor.
actually have thought about that one a lot. What if England had won? I think for Native Americans, it might have made somewhat of a difference, at least initially. No one was opposed to expanding westward in North America. And I don't want to paint the British as these humanitarians. They're very definitely focused on economic development and trade. By the same token, they realize wars cost money, and so they wanted to expand westward peacefully. But that's one of the things that actually starts the revolutionary movement. It's called the Proclamation of 1763. Just at the end of the French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War, there's a major uprising of different Native American groups on the frontier. Why? Because British colonists are spilling into this area and just trying to take their land. The British government suppresses this, but then the king sends out this proclamation that says, all right, we're not going to allow you to move westward for now until we figure out a way that we can do this peacefully, right? So we can all make money together is really what they're thinking. At any rate, we over here look at it as the evil king is taking away this land that we earned through conquest. So there's 2 very different competing narratives going on from the outset about westward expansion. So I think that, at least initially, as far as African Americans go, I mean, England does come out against the international slave trade by the early 19th century, but I don't know. That one I don't have an answer for, quite honestly, because I don't. Go ahead.
I can.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, based on the question and Professor McIntyre's response, the thing that I was thinking of, okay, do we end up as a really big Canada and I go, is that immeasurably better? Well, for Native Americans or for African Americans, and you go, and I'm sitting there going, and some of this I'm going in my head, I'm like, okay, I'm a little far afield with some of this, but I'm like, to my knowledge, the treatment of First Nations peoples through the arc of the 19th century isn't necessarily that great. Not at all. To my knowledge, yeah, the British get to, they're against the slave trade, earlier, having exploited peoples for centuries beforehand, and they get to abolition earlier than the Americans do by a couple decades, but like not by much necessarily. And so it is it happened sooner, and that's good. That's a good thing because slavery's bad. However, that would be a hard one to say. Yeah.
Absolutely. And they
think-
get to it, sorry, after
no,
they've
please.
made a great deal of money supporting it.
Yeah.
Right. I
So,
was just going to say that, until today, that there's traces back to that. Right, I would agree with both of you, and I think for the Native Americans, it was kind of a choice between a bad choice and a worse choice. I think this, as Jim mentioned, early on, the Native tribes could kind of play the French and the British off of one another, and then once the French were kind of out of the picture, then it's the British and the American colonials. But then it's like they're not stopping. I mean, there's no evidence. At least the British were, due to the fact of their monetary constraints, don't want them to move any further west. Not because they were sad about the land being taken away from them. It wasn't from that perspective. So I think that for those that stayed on the side of the British, it was more like, well, maybe we'll cast our lot with them because we might have a better chance with them than we will with the Americans. But there's a reference made as far as if you were enslaved. Lord Dunmore in Virginia offers this proclamation that for at the beginnings of the Revolution, for slaves who want to join, people who are enslaved to join the British Army, they'll promise them freedom at the end. And I think there's a reference at the end of the documentary, correct me if I'm wrong, that some of those who did join were kind of given freedom, and some moved to Canada, I believe, some lived freely afterwards. But for those that were in the Continental Army, because there were a lot of them, I think it was kind of ambiguous. I think for some of them,
absolutely.
it was a return to the circumstances they had been in, and for others, maybe they moved to other states. So that was that time after the Revolution where there could have been this promise to maybe fix things. They didn't, and it's one of those. It's so interesting to me because I wrote this down. There's a moment where, and it's discussed in the documentary and elsewhere, but where there's this, it's also, and I keep referencing John Adams, I'm sorry, but it's such a good book, and it's such a good series. If you have HBO, go watch it because it's fantastic. But there's overlap. The guy that plays John Adams in the HBO miniseries is Paul Giamatti, and he also does his voice in this American Revolution. But there's a scene where Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams are talking about the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. And Thomas Jefferson's got this draft out there, and Ben Franklin mentions, well, you're talking about holding the king responsible for slavery, but you're not mentioning the slave trade. So, and then he goes, well, no matter. We'll deal with that later. And that's pretty much like that's what we do, right? That's what we do from 1776 onward till the Civil War. That's kind of our pat response. We'll kick the can down the road, and that is what we did until we got to the Civil War. Would either of you? Is that fair to say? Would you say?
I would agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, related to the last question, it appears, in many ways, the American revolutionaries should have lost, nearly lost. I mean, it was definitely a struggle. Fortunate how it turned out. Could you maybe speak at all about how kind of military lessons in terms of challenges for England of being able to pursue this war from abroad, or with the long distance from England to the American continent, and just any other kind of challenges they faced that seem more applicable to maybe modern day challenges of the United States in places like Iraq or Afghanistan?
Jim?
We're both looking at you,
Oh, you mean don't try to wage a counterinsurgency when you're on the really unpopular side from half a world away?
Right.
when
That one.
when your opponent quickly realizes that if we drag this thing out, we'll just essentially bankrupt you and get your populace. I mean, by the 1780s in England, there are riots against the government, and one of the things that doesn't get talked about, the Americans, yes, we're the plucky underdogs, if you will, but we don't really have a navy, and England at the time had the largest navy in the world, but we do have a lot of what are called privateers. Think legalized pirate. At any rate, the privateers attacked British merchant shipping, And that in turn drove up insurance rates on cargoes in London to the point where the merchants were begging the king to just stop because they couldn't trade anymore. So there is like an underlying economic theme. I mean, it really, when I saw that question, the first thing that came to mind, John Ferling, who's done a lot of work on the American Revolution, in one of his books comments that if the British really were going to succeed in stopping the revolution, 1765 would have been their best chance, because that's when you have the Stamp Act come out. And the first beginnings of resistance to British rule haven't even really coalesced yet. So if they came in, and I'm not saying if they came in heavy-handed, more if they came in and said, okay, we're going to do things differently, whatever that looks like. We'll give you some form of representation in Parliament. One thing I've seen in some works is we'll appoint a viceroy for the Americas, so a representative from England that would actually listen to colonial leaders and bring their concerns back to London. Something along those lines. So, because again, you get that at least perception of representation, right? You get that feeling that you have input. Because remember the big slogan, taxation without representation. Even if we have the feeling of representation, that can go a long way to undercut this resistance movement because it really hasn't coalesced yet.
Go ahead, Josh, first.
The thing that I would say, building on Professor McIntyre, is the idea of, lessons or failures, is the idea of the centrality or importance of continued logistics, of the piracy that Professor McIntyre is mentioning is just, they can't supply themselves. No. And it just absolutely devastates them.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
I don't have much to add. This is my military history is not my thing at all, but I mean, think about it. You can't, home court advantage, right? You're fighting on your home soil versus fighting someplace else. You know what to do. It was interesting watching the scenes about Lexington and Concord, and one of the quotes that's taken from one of the Minutemen there, talking about the British firing on their own people. They still perceived themselves as being British, even up to that point. They still perceived it as when the British are firing on them, with the shot heard around the world, right, with those terrible flinty muskets that set off this whole big conflict, right? American colonials, for the most part, still perceived themselves as being British subjects who were being fired on by their mother country, right? And I really should not do this. I'm going to delve into a kind of a sports metaphor, which I know nothing about sports, and I will say that. But it was reminding me a bit of some of these Bears games, these last minute kind of saves in the fall. But it seems like a lot of the victories that the colonists seem to kind of pull out, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, were the result of these just mistakes that were being made constantly, and not necessarily because of their own prowess. There were some good moments, but it seems like even with George Washington, it's constantly trying to just not have our entire army get wiped out. How can we just hide from them and get around them so we don't lose the entire army right now? But that's where that home court advantage comes into play.
What's we're a nascent nation state building ourselves, kind of as the revolution is necessarily beginning. If anything, to Kevin's question, all of this demonstrates that nation states today struggle, as Jim said, to fight counterinsurgent wars. They're deeply complex, they're very difficult, and even throughout the 20th century, if you have great power, that's not necessarily going to help you. But to your point you want to fight a war of essentially annihilation versus a war of attrition, right? Sort of that kind of thing. Washington, he wants to keep the army to the best of his ability. You don't risk the army. It's one of the reasons why, of course, the whole attack at Trenton is such a big deal, is because he's risking the army, right? If you can avoid it, you don't risk the army. You want to, you win by existing. You don't necessarily win by taking territory. And that's, the Continental Army's existence continues the mission to achieve the political objective of the war, and that is certainly very much the case. Yeah, you're fighting an attritional war to sort of exhaust the British because you can't fight. was it Russell Weigley? Was it the strategy was war of poverty? Was it? Yeah. Of that you're essentially fighting a war of poverty because you don't have anything, right? So.
And think of how hard that would be with these guys that are farmers who in the middle of fighting are like, well, I gotta leave, gotta go home and take care of the harvest, like, see ya, and then they just go and take off. So you don't know how large of a force you're gonna have at the end of the season. Again, this is a pretty precarious war. The fact that they were able to pull this whole thing off is just kind of rather magnificent. It really is, right?
Yeah. I mean, Washington realizes early on he doesn't have to win, and that's it. And I think one of the criticisms that comes up is that Atkinson, one of the major figures they talk to, points out Washington is not a great battlefield leader. No. He loses more battles than he wins. And in fact, he gets outflanked by William Howe. In other words, Howe comes around and sneaks up on him the same way twice in 2 years. This is not a brilliant commander. But so on the battlefield, he might not be great, but strategically, thinking about how do we stay in this, he recognizes, I just have to not lose. As long as we're in this, there's a chance that something will happen. We'll get foreign aid from France, or the British will simply run out of blood and treasure. They'll run out of the will to keep trying to do this.
And well said. Your comments make me think of the United States having this huge military advantage and a lot of battle successes with Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan, but with all of the factors you mentioned with home field advantage, the counterinsurgency, winning by not losing, and kind of being motivated by independence and freedom and repelling this foreign invader, that definitely applies today. Related to this idea of like just how precarious the situation is for the American revolutionaries and winning over England, how about the role of France? I know that in recent decades there's been a lot of criticism of France. I remember during the 2003 Iraq War, the United States wants France an ally to help them to be part of the coalition of the willing. They don't participate, and I remember there being like a backlash of, instead of calling them French fries, they're going to be freedom fries. And even more recently, there's been criticism of France, like, hey, you didn't think us enough after World War II and us, the United States liberating you and all of that. So what about the role of France in helping the colonists and revolutionaries in fighting off England?
You want me to? Sure. I don't mind. Sure. So after the Battle of Saratoga, the military points of that, which I will leave to Jim, but after the battle is won, the French are like, hey, this is probably a pretty good idea for us to jump in on this action. And I think it's one of those, it's important to point out that this was not just, because I'll be honest, this is kind of more what I focus on too. I don't focus on this as like a global war, but one of you mentioned earlier just about how this was really like almost peripheral to the British as far as their other holdings, right? They're more worried about losing like Jamaica and their big money that they're making in like the Caribbean than they are about the the pittance that they're making by us in comparison. So France sees an opportunity like, hey, if we help the Americans, we can kind of like distract the British, make it harder for them, and therefore this kind of opens up some other opportunities throughout the world. And so they commit to sending troops. But you have to think about this. Again, we're talking about, this is the 1770s. It's going to take a while, right? Isn't it like Washington doesn't even find out for like 3 months that the French are going to enter in on this? So you're still operating not knowing what's actually going on. I can't imagine how difficult. I try to put myself in their shoes at the time. That information, constant information lag and not knowing, just compared to today's, we find out things like instantaneously as they're even happening before they're even done. And it doesn't really give you too much time to judge properly, I think, today, as opposed to maybe even back then you had a little bit more time. Anyway, so the French pledged to send in some troops. So they sent a few ships eventually. I'm giving a very rudimentary summarization that end up coming up to, don't they go up to like New York and like Rhode Island, something Delaware first, and then eventually kind of help seal the deal at Yorktown in 1781. So thanks to the French fleet that was sent from the Caribbean, they kind of help save the day. in exchange for which we promise that when it's their time to revolt, that we'll help them out. When that time does come, if any of you have seen Hamilton, you may be kind of familiar with that exchange. It's actually kind of a brilliant exchange. But the king of France, that was the one that kind of made that promise, was now dead. So we're like, we're going to kind of renege on that promise because we really can't help you out now because we're kind of, we can barely keep our own stuff together. So sorry, France, but thanks for that help.
Yeah.
We repaid them, I guess you could say, a couple hundred years later. In World War I and World War II, I suppose one could perhaps make that argument.
To connect it to the potential, counterfactuals that we were doing earlier, of do we win without France, is, I think, an interesting question. And, the way I've often understood it is, yes, but it takes a lot longer in order to be able to achieve it. But maybe, I don't know, to your point, yeah. And to Kevin's point, I was just also thinking, yeah, I remember walking into an establishment once, about 20 years ago, and they said, what specials do you have? You can have anything you want, provided it's not French. Of sort of that kind of thing. Of that there was this very, very anti. No, we owe the French a lot. Of half the troops at Yorktown are French, the artillery, everything else is French, of the fleet is French, they are an absolute central actor in the achievement of victory against the British in the manner in which it occurs. Of period, paragraph. Yeah, absolutely.
And I would add, look, I would respectfully disagree. Without French aid, we don't win. I mean, the Continental Congress is bankrupt. Rochambeau, the French commander, manages to get like several thousand livres, the French currency, in silver. It's the only time the Continental Army gets paid in cash. And the reason they pay them in cash is because they're afraid if they don't, between marching from New York down to Yorktown, they'll disintegrate. They'll all just go running off because they haven't been paid. They don't have uniforms. You mentioned that there's at least half the troops at Yorktown are French. Most of the Americans there are carrying French muskets. So it's the material aid is huge, and extremely costly for France. I mean, the debt France, and to be balanced about this, one of France's motivations is they get beat badly in the 7 Years' War, and they lose a lot of their colonial empire to England. And so they also see this as a chance to maybe, at the very least, knock England down a few pegs. There's a big theory diplomatically in Europe of balance of power, that no state should be so strong as to dominate the others. And most of Europe is looking at England or Great Britain at that time as, you're too strong, you're too powerful. Pardon me. And what you notice is that not only, France and Spain and Holland come in on our side, but there's also in Eastern Europe what's called the League of Armed Neutrality, where Prussia, Austria, Russia refuse to help England. So there's a strong sort of, you need to be brought back in line, Great Britain. But yeah, the debt France accrues contributes in no small way to their revolution.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, Jim, you just reminded me. There's a great anecdote actually in the series when the French fleet does come ashore, and initially the people in the town are like, French frog eaters, we don't want them here, get them out of here. And then they pull out the silver, and then it's like, come on in, make it rain. Like, they were thrilled to see them, so that opened up all the doors.
One more question before we turn it over to our audience to see if you have questions or comments. In talking and thinking about all these different ways that the war could have turned out differently, what about the role of George Washington? One of the historians in the film had said something to the effect of, "I'm not a believer in the great man theory," but he was seemingly second guessing that. Criticism of the great man theory. So maybe a little bit about the great man theory, or the role of George Washington, and maybe, again, how this could have turned out differently, not just with maybe the war, but the early America and the, as being the first president.
Yeah. You guys want to go first?
Go right ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I did appreciate that scene as well, because they don't, you can't really deify, it's easy to deify George Washington, but I can't help, what he did was really remarkable. The idea that, and there's a joke made about it kind of in Hamilton, where George III, played by the wonderful Jonathan Groff in the Broadway version, but where he's like, he's giving up power. Like, I didn't know that was something a person could do. Like, you could do that? Like, really? So like after the revolution, like he takes off his uniform and is like, I'm gonna be a civilian, go back to my civilian life. And eventually he's called back into the fold again and again to try to help kind of rescue this country. But he does so willingly, because he does not want to be a tyrant, and he doesn't want the country to descend back into what they just fought against. So I think it's difficult to not sort of, in a way, not to deify him. He was a man who owned slaves, right? He was a man who viewed, even though there were Native Americans that fought with him that he respected, how much respect did he really have for them, right? There's a lot of contradictions that were going on with him. But at the same time, he held this like remarkable, crazy coalition of people together. And it sounds like he kind of did this by force of personality, that he was able to, and how many times that in throughout the documentary that there's this moment in multiple battles where it's turning into a rout. And these soldiers are the colonials, the rebels were running in the opposite direction. And George Washington literally like rides into the fray and he's like, stop, like with his body, where his own men are like, don't do that, we don't, if he gets shot, we're dead, we're over, it's done. But he like single-handedly stops like a barrage of people leaving and retreating, running away. It's several times, right? So it's kind of hard to not have some like uber respect for him. And again, for what he did after, because he could have set the tone for something. He's the guy that sets the two-term tone, right? He's the guy that, there was nothing in the Constitution originally that says, it's always my trick question, how I get people, what does the Constitution originally say about terms, term limits? There are no term limits in the original Constitution. So any president could theoretically keep running and running and running. But if you look at any pictures of a president, kind of the before and after photos, they look like the Crypt Keeper from Tales from the Crypt. They look like a skeleton, because the job ages you so much. And he died about a year after leaving office. But he willingly left office because he's like, okay, I've done my job, I'm done. And he sets up this precedent for other people to do the same. And nobody goes for 2 terms up until Roosevelt, till Franklin Roosevelt, during World War II and the Depression. So, I mean, again, I think it's really difficult to not admire him for so many reasons, while also being cognizant of his many flaws. People are complicated.
The thing that I might sort of add on is for those who are unaware, so the idea of the sort of great man theory of history, or approach to history, speaks to kind of overall theories of historical approach or study. Much of it comes to the idea of where do you see, as through lines or core themes as ultimately driving sort of the arc of history overall, right? And there are lots of different ways to approach this, and have been through time. You'll find some historians who would argue that, it's economics that singularly drives history. For others, it's certain aspects of culture, it's race, class, gender, right? This kind of thing. You've got all these different schools of thought and approach, and you'll see, especially over the last, let's say, 100 years or so, kind of a move away from an embrace of this idea of a great man theory of history, and the idea that sort of history is sort of driven or moved basically by one great, one guy drives this or moves all of this, then the next one moves all this, then the next one moves all of this, and to say that, it's not necessarily this one guy who moves all of this doesn't necessarily demean their accomplishments. It sort of says, is the entirety of America's experience in World War II encapsulated by, the day-to-day operations of FDR? No, you have to take it all in total, right? You have to see all of it. And that doesn't demean FDR, but we want to make sure that we don't demean, those who are serving in other aspects of the sort of the process there. And so, much of the historical community has sort of moved away from this idea of emphasizing history as the arc of sort of the lives of these great men, sort of that kind of thing. And I would certainly agree, with you, Mary, is the idea that, it's, he's certainly a flawed individual who reflected his time, but his commitment to sort of that civil military dynamic is remarkable within that age. I'm thinking of the Newburgh, conspiracy and sort of this kind of thing, and the Cincinnatus sort of connections are very real, within the context of this era, in that, yes, he's being offered all power and he turns it away. That's, the knowledge or understanding of history that those within his day had were to, comparisons to Greece and Rome and to Republican Rome and sort of, well, what happened to Republican Rome and sort of what do you do about all of that, and to avoid that kind of all-encompassing power, which I think as well, even though this is a question about Washington and great men, I'm thinking back to some of the earlier part of the day. I don't know. I really like Thomas Paine. I always find Thomas Paine very interesting. I was trying to think of a modern connection to him, sort of the idea, but I really like Thomas Paine of, he's very much reflecting that push against authority, as you mentioned at the beginning of this. Absolutely.
Yeah. Kings are weird.
Kings are weird.
Yeah. The only thing I would add is it's also important with Washington to keep in mind that we know the George Washington that George Washington wanted us to know. On his death, on his orders, all of his personal papers were destroyed. So all we have are basically his official correspondence. And obviously, you're going to say different things in a letter to Thomas Jefferson or John Hancock when he's president of Congress and your boss than you might write about John Hancock in your personal diary, right? And then you might be venting spleen, venting your feelings about your frustrations and saying, it would be really tempting to to seize power just for a few days to get things. So point is, and I think that's also part of the allure, and not so much the great man idea, but there is a certain fascination with Washington. And I think it's because he's an enigma. Because I often tell students, when you look at Washington, right, you see that sort of sculpted face, right, that's on so many statues, it's on the dollar bill, right? But he's the one that we really don't know as a human being. And that, I think, is part of the why people get fascinated by him.
It's a bit of an enigma. That's true. That's interesting.
Excellent. So now turn it over to the audience. Questions, comments that you would like the panelists to consider? Yeah, in the back. Yeah.
In what ways does George Washington? In what way does George Washington see his leadership in today's American political culture?
Okay, so the question was, how would George Washington see his political leadership in today's Washington? In today's world?
Like reflected in the leaders of today? Like, do you mind if I ask a clarification? Yeah. Like, are you asking, just for clarification, please, are you asking like how does George Washington see like the way that he governed reflected today, do you mean? Like in today's political leaders?
Sure, yes.
Okay. Or what would he make of what's going on today? Are you also kind of asking that?
What way does Washington leadership still influence American political and today's culture?
Oh, okay. All right, still influence. Okay.
So just want to repeat it one more time. We have a recording. So in what ways does Washington
Leadership still
Yeah, thank you.
influence American political culture.
In what ways does Washington's leadership still influence Washington's political culture?
Yeah, America's current political culture. I gotta think about that for a second. We're gonna like silence. Jim?
I would go,
Okay.
I would go with
Go, Jimmy.
very little.
Yeah.
Washington and many of his contemporaries had this notion of civic duty. It's a, and I talked about this at another discussion in the fall. It's a very, very different political dynamic in the 18th century. Civic duty was you served if you were called upon. You didn't run for an office. If you ran for an office, the perception was you wanted it for some kind of ill gain, right? You were corrupt already. But Washington, on the flip side, keeping things in perspective, Washington was very much an elitist. He believed that only the top strata of society, I mean, if you look at these founders, let's be realistic, they're all really rich white guys. And in Washington's mind, those were the only people who should rule. Okay, so it's a very, very different dynamic. They're not, they don't favor democracy. They really take the idea of the Roman Republic, of people should be represented by their quote unquote betters, which is anathema today, right? Like we look at anyone, anyone can grow up to be president, right? So it's kind of a 180 from Washington's day.
I would only echo what Professor McIntyre said. I mean, that idea of representative democracy is not exactly something that in the era of political culture of Washington at the time that would have been sort of respected and viewed. I'm mindful once of a lecture. It was about, I think it had to do with like Hamilton and the Jay Treaty in this debate. And Hamilton's walking alongside the street and somebody's talking about, aspects of the Jay Treaty. And Hamilton basically turns and goes, and this is just some random, guy in a bar, sort of a tavern. He just basically, he's the sitting Secretary of the Treasury. He's like, do you know how much we don't care about you? It's a lot. Like, it really was, the elitist sort of thing that Professor McIntyre is saying, is very much the case. I think, if we're to look at the administration, there's some aspects of what the vice presidency becomes that we get sort of institutional cultural approaches to that, in that era-ish, a little bit. There's debates in that era of like, what do we call the president, sort of that kind of thing of do we call the president, Your Excellency, right? Sort of that kind of stuff. So we start to get initial aspects of, well, how elitist should we go? Because with Washington, you have elitism, but then you have this sort of at least public swinging back with, with Jefferson in terms of at least his outward appearance. However, he's still incredibly elitist, is also the owner of many enslaved persons, right? Sort of that kind of thing. So, but that's also still then the, really wealthy elitist who dresses a certain way and wants to say, I'm just like everybody else. Not necessarily. There's certainly that too. When I often, think about some of this era, and kind of how things would translate to today, I would often think of those at the end of the 18th century would just be deeply shocked by by the technology of our times and sort of that kind of thing, because it is in so many ways so vastly different than what our lives are today.
And the liberties we've given up,
Yes.
the privacy and the liberties that we've given up. Yeah, because I don't really have much to add to what either of you said. I think you both said it beautifully, but that's,
Yeah.
I would jump in on that. Because that was something I did write down. One thing that I didn't mention this earlier, but that did kind of strike me. It was interesting to read or to watch how Samuel Adams, which we only really know about him, his name is thrown around because of beer, right? But he kind of gets lost because you know about his cousin John, who's a president. But it was interesting to read about how Samuel Adams, or watch, I'm sorry, I keep saying read, how he was a kind of a failure as a businessman, but was a great sort of purveyor of grievance. That he wrote, like, I wrote some of the things down, like, that he could speak to kind of the common ordinary man, right? And that he, in one of his quotes, was about giving, like, he was able to drum up new offenses, new crimes, new injustices, and kind of rile people up. In this case, against the king in the years before the revolution. So that's just this kind of a non sequitur, but I found that to be just really interesting, and I forgot to throw it in earlier. They highlighted him, I think, quite a bit more than he usually does get mentioned. But I found that to be an interesting correlation to today, the idea of that pushing that grievance and how that grievance is used to divide people, and how effectively it's done, whether it's in the 18th century or whether it's today.
I'll just add, I'm not a historian, but to use some of your own arguments as somebody who sometimes can be cynical about politics today, the idea of elitist, really rich, the white should rule, some who disregard democracy today, like that isn't that. Those elements haven't quite gone away.
No.
At least among some people.
They're making a comeback.
In
Yeah.
leadership. And then maybe just that idea, and I don't think this is exactly what you asked about, but just how his physical attributes of George Washington, just being a tall, stoic, kind of tough person, so to speak, and the way that kind of set a precedent and for the type of qualities that we might be looking for in a president. And I think there was quite a long line of presidents who had military experience up until recent, the last handful of presidents, maybe since the 1990s. I can't remember.
Yeah,
maybe,
H.W. Bush would have been the last one,
but
right? Yeah.
yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
other questions, comments? Yes, Annadelle.
Ooh, that's a good question.
Okay. So Annadelle's question is, in 20 or 30 years from now, would
Our history matter more to? Like, are you saying, are we going to be talking about the revolution as much in 20 or 30 years, or are they going to be looking at this time period more as like the time when the United States like kind of crumbled? Is that kind of what you're what you're asking, like that where the republic comes tumbling down? And I don't want to put words in your mouth, so forgive me. That's not if that's not what you meant. Is that kind of what you were?
yeah.
Sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot going on right now. Yeah. That's a really good, I mean, I think about this a lot. I'm sure you all do too. Like, how are people going to write? How is this history going to be written later on? The things that are occurring right now. I think about even when I'm having discussions with family members, because I have family members that, we disagree on a lot of stuff. And I think, like, what are your grandkids going to ask you later on? Like, how are they, when they ask you what you thought about this or that, like, how are you going to respond to that? I have a pretty decent idea in my mind of how I think it's going to be written, but we're also now in an era where the truth, I mean, has there ever been a time when the truth is agreed upon? No, but I guess it depends on how all this shakes out. I don't know, I gotta be honest. I would have been very clear on this, I think, a couple of years ago, and I'm having a harder time answering this now. I don't know. Sorry, my answer just kind of trailed off. I'm sorry. I thought I was going to say something, and I'm like, I don't know if I can answer that now the same way.
My first thought to the question was, it's been a long time since Lincoln, and Lincoln is still often written about and talked about and commented on and engaged with by all kinds of parties who want all things. Of the same thing is true, I think, with aspects of the revolution. I can't both. You never know with counterfactuals because they're counterfactuals, and you never know about the future because it's the future necessarily. But what I can certainly say in terms of past practice is that as each generation goes, they engage with these things in different ways. So I don't know necessarily what the revolution is going to be written about. It's probably going to be, YouTubed, of, it's going to be engaged with in, maybe even new forms of media that we haven't even thought up yet, beyond whatever happens after TikTok or happens after sort of other things. Now, whether folks are going to necessarily use it for their own ends, that's certainly going to be, history, can sometimes have that where folks will find what they want in it to justify certain things on many sides. But it's a good question. It's a very thoughtful question, though.
I think it's, again, it's a very profound question. I honestly think that we're also going to see a lot more proliferation of voices talking about it. Right now, there really isn't any kind of like academic journal that focuses on the American Revolution, but there is an online blog called All Things Liberty. And so a lot of people submit things to that. And so I think where materials are produced, how they're produced, I know some of the folks involved with All Things Liberty. One of them is a really top-notch historian. Okay, is it going to stay that way? Who knows? But I think, for good or ill, our technology, has become a great leveler. It's opened up, like, here's this, a couple times a week I get an article in my inbox, whether I want it or not. So.
The thing that I would, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
The thing that I would also add is, as you were speaking, Professor, is that it also depends on what gets digitized in that time. I would say that one of the things, there is often a debate about the idea of, well, historical revisionism as necessarily being a fundamentally bad thing, right? But part of this has to do with the idea that sources come to the forefront or engage with more, or that there's greater access to something now, and so we can now learn more of, the way that I will often describe sort of aspects of understanding history is like, imagine you go to a Cubs game, right? And everyone's at the same game, but everybody's there under a wide variety of different circumstances, and so their experiences are fundamentally necessarily different. And then where we end up getting the chronicles of how those folks experience the game can vary, and some might not tell their story until decades later. And so what gets digitized between now and then, and what kinds of resources exist to be able to access those things, is going to change. And who knows what kinds of archival stuff is going to get digitized that folks can engage with, and will contribute to, kind of highlighting different voices, as you mentioned, that might not have necessarily been highlighted yet. Who knows? Time will tell. But, the last 10, 15 years has been a wonderful time period. I mean, you have all kinds of debates of, things on the internet and all of that, certainly, but I am, very much loving some, of the different forms of digitization of primary documents that have come forward, and kind of where that's going to take us, not only for the history of the revolution, but for other aspects of the history of the country.
Great question. Other questions from the audience? One of the kind of follow-up questions, I think somewhat related to the last question. I think if you polled the average American on the street of like what happened in the Boston Massacre and how many people died, at least I would have answered it for much of my life that a lot of people died, maybe hundreds or thousands. And I think from the video they talked about maybe 5 or 6, which is, in 2026, 25 standards, like that's just like one mass shooting that we have pretty frequently in the United States, or more contemporary of just like more people have died in ICE border custody or interactions with them in the last 40 days.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know. Thoughts on just how powerful and pivotal that the Boston Massacre was, despite the limited number of people who died, and how the potential for something like, Renee Good or Alex Preddy or one of these protesters that was killed at the hands of ICE or Border Patrol, and the way that these seemingly small number of casualties can really be pivotal in a mass movement or change.
Like a catalyst.
Catalyst for
moment.
change.
Yeah.
That's a really good question.
Yeah, it is.
I think a big part of it was that the Sons of Liberty in Boston, the group that was at the heart of sort of resistance against British power, seized control of the narrative and they didn't let it go.
No.
Not only did they depict this, that it's a horrific event, yes, but they very much emphasized, right, that the British were wrong. To the extent that John Adams actually defended these British soldiers, and he was getting death threats while he was taking the cases to trial. I think that, well, that's a whole nother aside I won't get into. At any rate, though, that not only in the short term, but every year afterwards, right? The Boston Massacre is March of 1770. Every year they commemorated it into 1775 with what they called the Massacre Oration. It was like, in case you've forgotten, we're going to have someone give a big talk about how evil the British were and still are. So that's why I say they seized control of that narrative and they never let it go.
Yeah.
They kept using it to kind of, push forward this resistance movement.
Go ahead. And despite even when because I'll ask my students, when you hear the word massacre, what do you think? The very question that Kevin is pointed out. And yet, despite it, we still keep using the word massacre, right? Even though it's pointed out. And when you look at it, if you look at that time period, we kind of forget because we look at these things as being from that happened in the past as just being sort of in this different time, and we forget that day-to-day life was going on ordinarily. But you think of these things that if you were living at that time, how would you look at that and what actually happened? The idea of these Sons of Liberty guys who were throwing ice chips and they were throwing things at the sentinels who were guarding the customs house, and one of the muskets perhaps went off, whatever, and it ended up degrading into this quote unquote massacre. But even after that, to Jim's point, you had these mobs of people that were turning out throughout different cities, throughout the colonies, that were going after tax collectors. And when you see an image of it in a textbook, when they're tarring and feathering someone, it looks like this innocuous picture, like, oh, they're almost like they're playing with them, and putting feathers on them. No, they were boiling, they were pouring, they would strip a person down, and they would pour like boiling oil, basically, for lack of a better, on them, hot tar, thank you.
Roofing tar.
Thank you,
Yep.
I couldn't think of the word. Thank you. They would, but it was at a boiling point, tar, right, that would give you 3rd, 4th degree burns. People would die from this. And then they would, not everybody, but many people did, and then put feathers on them. And when you see it in a textbook, it looks like this just little innocuous thing, but then when you actually see it played out, it's horrific. So if you lived at that time, how would you look at that, at those moments? Would you look at the Sons of Liberty as being like thugs? Because I think about if I was living at that time, if I was living in Boston, I probably would look at them as being, I wouldn't want to associate with them if those are the tactics they were using. And if they're using this propaganda, and if they're lying and they're obfuscating or they're exaggerating about the things that were happening, I probably wouldn't have supported them very much. But we look back on it now from this lens of history as they are, like they are, the patriots who are fighting for all of us, and we kind of deify them to a degree, right? I think it's a little scary.
Yeah.
Nothing scarier than a mob.
Down to about 5 minutes. Any final questions from the audience? One.
Can I? Oh, go ahead.
go ahead.
No. Go ahead. No, please.
Go for it.
I just had the one guy I wanted to talk about. My one criticism of this documentary that has nothing to do with any of the questions that we were asking. Do any of you know who George Rogers Clark is? Nobody. See, I kind of, sort of. I know you guys know who he is. So I was super excited when this came out because I teach Illinois local history, and it's a subject that we cover in pretty great depth. And that is one of my critiques of the documentary. And I'll make this quick. But basically, he's the guy responsible for us having, for the Americans, and you could maybe argue they would have gotten it anyway, but we have Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, the Northwest Territory at that time that was controlled by the French up until 1763, and then was taken over by the British. And basically this dude went into these various forts and like took them over without much of a fight. But the documentary, I felt, kind of did him a little dirty, in my opinion. I felt it did, because they portrayed him as this sort of this kind of savage guy. When really he did commit violence, and he did strike down about 5 or 6 Native Americans in front of Fort Vincennes, but that was to strike fear in the heart of the people that were in the fort, and then they opened up the fort and they surrendered to avoid an all-out battle. So that was one of my critiques. I had to throw it out there for the sake of posterity, that George Rogers Clark basically funded these guys out of his own money. He was a very charismatic leader, 6'3", 6'4", tall redhead guy. You can never miss him in a room. A lot of charisma. His men loved him, and I just felt like Ken Burns did him a little dirty. Just thought I would throw that out there. Thank you. Just all I have to say.
And I think that's perhaps a good way to end it. Jim and Josh, do you have other, like, one last thing that you wanted to say that you haven't been able to say yet, something from the film that kind of concluding remarks?
The thing that I would say is that, you know, if you haven't watched it yet, it's a good place to start. And that many of the commentators that are there for this work have all written extensively about a wide variety of subjects as it relates to the revolution and the American experience. And if any of the watching kind of leads you to kind of go explore some of those written works, do it. It's a good thing. That's good. Because I think it can help, to get perspective, with any aspect of history, the revolution, as an example. But I hope it serves as that good gateway that it should.
I would agree. I think that it, overall, though we have had some criticisms, nothing is perfect. But this will give you a good starting point, absolutely. And I would definitely shout out to Frédéric Hebert, who talked a lot about the Hessians in the documentary, and she did a phenomenal book on them. And they come across, she gives them a much fairer shake than I think history has up to this point. One thing that she points out, not so much in the documentary, but in the book, if you were one of these Hessian soldiers and you refused to come here, they would confiscate your home and your farm. So you really had no choice. Okay, and so that's why a lot of them tended to desert once they were here, because that's different than refusing to come over here in the first place. So,
Well, please join me in thanking our panelists and our interpreter, Michelle, up front. And thank you all for being here. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody.